2,786 New Yorkers move to North Carolina every month. And while some find that they love this place, many discover that they hate it too. So I'm gonna break down the top 5 reasons New Yorkers regret moving to North Carolina. Number 5 is the weather. Can you handle the extreme weather that North Carolina gets? Compared to New York, we're a whole lot more moderate down here. The weather is a lot more tolerable, with the summers being more humid, but also probably pretty similar temperature-wise. And the winters are really, really nice, like very comfortable. You don't have to break out some heavy winter coat, especially if you're from the north like me. You can very comfortably wear long pants and shorts and maybe a long sleeve t-shirt all the way through the winter. And there's usually only a week or two every year that I even need a jacket. We do get probably more rain through the winter months, but that's honestly a really easy trade to make for not having to shovel any snow whatsoever, because that's something I definitely don't miss. North Carolina in the fall is also very beautiful. The foliage just lights up with bright yellows and bright oranges and bright reds. And it reminds me, especially as you get into the mountains, a lot of upstate New York during the fall. We do have some more extreme weather because especially as you get more towards the coast, North Carolina will get not hurricanes, but the blowback, the leftovers from the hurricanes that usually hit Florida, go into the Atlantic, and then boomerang back and hit somewhere between Wilmington and Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. When that happens, we will get extra rain, places like Charlotte and Asheville, but it's really just kind of a day that's super rainy and not much more than that. Number 4, can you handle the crazies on the road down here? Let's get behind the wheel on transportation. We have a very car-centric lifestyle, I guess you would say here. Even in the cities, Charlotte's the most progressive as far as public transportation. And while we do have a fairly extensive bus system, the only sort of public transport that's really, really efficient here is the light rail. And that only services a single swath, one long line crossing the entire city of Charlotte. Outside of that, there's not really any major public transport in all of North Carolina, and there are plans to continue to expand more of the light rail in Charlotte. And we do have trains that go between cities and between areas here, like the Amtrak, but it's not going to be your primary mode to get around here. So if you are looking for some place that's going to have subways that can take you everywhere, North Carolina is probably not the place for you. You'll probably want to stay somewhere that does have an extensive metro system like New York or DC or maybe Chicago. Now, as you're driving around, there's going to be plenty of parking everywhere. It's pretty easy to get around by car. It's nothing like trying to drive in New York City. The traffic here, even at the absolute worst of times, is way better than New York, way better than DC, way better than pretty much every other major metro. And so that's really a blessing that we take for granted down here. Now, the one thing that is way crazier, in my opinion, than New York is some of the driving that you will see here. People just lose their cool and go nuts. I have driven a fair amount in New York. I used to live in upstate. I have friends in Brooklyn and on Long Island. I've been all over New York, through the city, all over Long Island, and I've never seen anything there that remotely compares to some of the crazy driving that I've experienced here. People weaving through traffic, people street racing, which granted, North Carolina is the NASCAR capital of the world, but it still is insane when you see 2 Dodge Chargers that are just roaring down the highway. Granted, I've only really seen that most of the time around Raleigh, only a couple of times around Charlotte, but it still is something that you need to be aware of, and people will cut you off, people will yell profanities, and it is something that I only experienced a handful of times in New York, but I have experienced at least monthly living in North Carolina. Now, the next logical thing after road rage is obviously going to be Southern hospitality, coming in at number 3. Something crazy happens. I don't know if it's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde or what, but as soon as people step out from behind the wheel, it's all smiles and warm welcomes. And Southern hospitality is a very real thing. We like to relax, we like to sit on wraparound porches, drink sweet tea, chat with the family, and have a good, relaxing time. And if you're in business, one of the biggest things that I noticed when moving here from living particularly a lot in the Northeast, I lived in Jersey, I lived in Philly, I lived in upstate New York, I traveled a lot to Long Island for work. I traveled a lot to DC, Baltimore. I was all over, and particularly and also New Hampshire and Maine, particularly relative to the Northeast. People like to keep the pace slow here. So you cannot rush into a meeting or conversation or even talking to somebody in line at the grocery and get down to business. You got to chop it up with some small talk. You got to really get to know the person a little bit, and then you can get down to talking business. We like to talk about the weather. We like to talk about sports. We like to ask, how's it going? And one of the things that absolutely surprised me is when people ask about your day and how you're doing, they really do care. Many people really do care down here. Obviously not everybody, but that's anywhere. But relative to the Northeast, people are so friendly, and it's very genuine. Now that we've talked about the people and the pace of life here, let's talk about the animals and the wildlife here. Coming in at number 2. If you think that North Carolina is just some wild, undeveloped country, you are both right and wrong. Places like Charlotte are extremely developed. Much of Raleigh, very developed. When you get out into the mountains and into the boonies, it's pretty undeveloped. But for the most part, a lot of North Carolina is very developed, and anything that touches water, it is all pretty much developed with either lakefront, waterfront properties, or beach towns. And it's a wonderful thing, but one of the things that most people don't realize, and I didn't realize when I came here, is that means in the mountains, we do have bears. Not in the mountains, we have snakes. You see all that tall grass behind me? There are definitely snakes out in there. We have big spiders. We have giant spiders. We have geckos. We have all sorts of things that I don't want to get anywhere near. And I've seen, and I have run away screaming like a little girl before, including alligators. Yes, North Carolina does have alligators when you get out towards the coast, which is why I am very safely inland. True story. If you're in the city, enjoy the city. But if you're not in the city, if you're out in nature, please be safe. Please enjoy the nature, but also be aware there are bears. There are things out there that you need to be careful of. Carry bear spray. If you got dogs, put bear bells on them. If you're hiking by yourself, put bear bells on your backpack. And if you don't know what bear bells are, they look like this, and you put them on your backpack or on your dog, and they make noise and they scare away black bears, because black bears don't like humans just as much as humans don't want anything to do with black bears. Carry some method of self-defense if you're out in the woods by yourself. Carry bear spray or an appropriately sized firearm, legally, of course, if you're going hiking, because it's always better to be safe than sorry. So that said, we do have some of the best nature of any state around. Just please be responsible and enjoy it safely. So now that we've had a chance to enjoy some of the free amenities like nature, what about the things that aren't free? What about the cost of living coming in at the number one thing people don't understand? North Carolina has been a very well kept secret for many years until it really wasn't anymore. And so particularly in very upscale areas around Charlotte, around Asheville, around Raleigh, and around some of the other coastal areas, it's really not going to be a whole lot cheaper than even Long Island. And it certainly isn't going to be any cheaper than more rural parts of New York. When you're looking at it in terms of the overall cost of living, especially for people coming from New York City, there are going to be some pretty significant savings. The biggest one is going to be the state income tax rate is 4.5% for North Carolina, compared to, depending on where you fall, on New York's progressive tax rate. Many of the clients that I've worked with fall somewhere all in, if they're from the city, between that 10 to 13% mark, and if they're not, more about that 6.5% mark. So there will be pretty significant savings in terms of income tax if you were to move here. That said, our median income is significantly lower than New York, so the people that get the most benefit from that are people that work from home or get to transfer and keep their existing salary with their current company. Many people are also very surprised to learn that our property tax rates are pretty comparable to much of New York's. In some cases a little bit cheaper, and in other cases actually a little bit more expensive depending on where you're looking. Now that said, property values and the cost to buy a home here, you can either get twice as much home for the same money, or you can get, the same home for about half as much money. And that's really where people see the biggest savings in terms of cost of living, but also it's not what it used to be. Many people that come down here are expecting property values to be a fifth or a tenth of what they are in New York, and sometimes even a third or a half of what they are in upstate New York, and that's just not the case. If you want a nice home in an upscale area, it is very common to spend between $600,000 to $800,000 here. If you want a starter home in a good area, it is very common to spend between $300,000 and $500,000 here. And if you want a true estate, it is very common to spend $3 to $5 million minimum here. So while North Carolina offers everything from starter homes and condos up to large equestrian farms and true mansions and estates, just be realistic that it's cheaper than New York, but maybe not as much as you might think. And if you want to know all the pros and cons of North Carolina's largest city, Charlotte, North Carolina, check out this video I made over here. People, especially people from New York, tend to really like it. My name's Lucas Roller, your realtor to find and buy the perfect home in North Carolina.